If you add all these together, what you get are the tentacles of a state that no longer trusts its citizens. It's basically deciding that autocracy and authoritarianism is the only way that America can survive. And then you're being asked to say, oh, well, that's all being done in the name of, sorry, free speech? Sorry?
Their reaction, I think, is deeply disturbing, because I think that part of their reaction beyond their human grief is clearly a weaponization of his assassination. That's what we're seeing.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And J.D. Vance has taken the place of a man he calls his good friend, Charlie Kirk, on what would have been Charlie Kirk's own podcast this week. And I think the kindest way to see some of the comments that we're going to hear is through the lens of grief, perhaps. There is no question that J.D. Vance was close to Charlie Kirk. There is every understanding that it was Charlie Kirk who petitioned Trump as a candidate for president to put J.D. Vance in that role. And so I suppose the way this makes the most sense is if you think that J.D. Vance is in a deep state of grief and wants to take whatever feels like the revenge for his dear friend would be. The trouble is, when you're the vice president, it's not just like you're screaming into the void. Your words have actions. And he essentially said in this podcast, it was a vow that he would dismantle institutions on the left that he claims promote violence and terrorism. He's already denounced two of the country's most prominent liberal foundations. He is going after whatever he decrees to be a radical left group.
This does not come in isolation. We saw in the immediate wake of Charlie Kirk's appalling murder, President Trump himself take to the airwaves, obviously perhaps himself in a state of some grief, but doing in the first half of the speech what presidents normally do in this situation, what we saw his predecessors do in this situation, say that violence is appalling, that political violence is appalling, send his heart out to Charlie Kirk's family, who of course must be and have been suffering terribly. But then Trump did something that I think that no contemporary president, possibly no other president in American history would have done, which is immediately turn a corner. And instead of doing the thing that American presidents and political leaders do, which is to try and take the temperature down, he decided to try and put the temperature up by blaming explicitly, on the basis of that time, of no evidence. And we still, to this day, right, nearly a week on, can't be certain yet of the motives of his murderer. Lots and lots of speculation, but not much evidence from the authorities yet. He decided to blame far left groups and say that uniquely, the far left has a particular role, has a unique role, has a sole responsibility for the ratcheting up of political tension and the use of political violence in the United States. Now, we know statistically that is wrong. In fact, according to the US government's own data, they say that the right and far right are responsible for the majority of politically related violence in the United States. Obviously, one can immediately think of one of the biggest moments of political violence in American history itself, which is January the 6th, where Trump's own supporters literally went to the Capitol with a saying, "Hang Mike Pence," the then US vice president. Trump decides to come back to office and release all of the people who were responsible for that. But this isn't just a rhetorical thing. We're seeing from the president's top staff, including Stephen Miller, going on Charlie Kirk show with Vance and talking, I think, in one of the most chilling ways that I've heard a politician or public official speak in my lifetime.
Absolutely chilling, as you say, the idea that Trump's deputy chief of staff talks about the uprooting of an organised campaign behind Charlie Kirk's murder and the threat of uprooting and dismantling these terrorist networks. But I think even before you get to chilling, what it shows is a massive lack of understanding in what has just gone on in America over the shooting of Charlie Kirk. And as we said last week, that shooting was absolutely abhorrent. And some of the remarks that came from President Trump were before there was any known shooter, known identity behind the killing, which does make it feel more like a justification for something that they kind of already had up their sleeve, they kind of already had planned. But the more that we get to know about this 22-year-old man, Robinson, the more, frankly, confusing the whole picture becomes. What do we know about him so far, the alleged shooter of Charlie Kirk? We know that he grew up in a Mormon family. We know he grew up in a Republican family. We understand they didn't have many Democrat friends. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean he couldn't have leanings one way or the other. But as soon as you actually look into what we've understood on any level about the messaging he put on those bullets, on the casings, what you start to understand is that this is not remotely about right or left. This is about gaming memes. This is about nihilistic sort of denial of self or motivation or sense of purpose. You have to go quite deep to understand some of the kind of weird internet jokes that have been written down, like he puts notices bulge, oh whoa, what's this? That comes from an internet sex joke about furry roleplay. When he says Bella Ciao, you know, the Ciao Bella Ciao is an anti-fascist song by the video game Far Cry 6. Hey Fascist comes from, I think, Helldivers 2. In other words, you have to be pretty well versed in a lot of fairly deep internet gaming to understand even a quarter of the messaging that he was trying to inject if those bullet casings tell us a story about motive. And you know what? Guess what? It doesn't break down into left or right. It doesn't break down into gay or not gay. It doesn't break down into family background or political beliefs. It suggests that he came from a very heavily, deeply sort of rabbit-holed existence, which was majorly online, which probably talks to him being a loner, being somebody who didn't know kind of where he was going, what he was doing, what his sense of purpose was. And I think, but as soon as the administration ignore all of that, ignore anything that sort of talks to what is clearly obvious to much younger people, you know, to the sort of staffers around the people in power who could understand what is going on here a bit better, that it just feels like they're using this to tell whatever story they had pre-planned.
I've no doubt at all that some of the people involved, including perhaps Vance, Miller, others, are genuinely aggrieved, genuinely in mourning, shocked by the death of their friend. It must be an appalling event and a senseless event. I am nonetheless, well, I don't know if I'm surprised or shocked, but nonetheless, their reaction, I think, is deeply disturbing, because I think that part of their reaction beyond their human grief is clearly a weaponization of his assassination. That's what we're seeing. Because a rational person looking at this might think and try and analyse and try and reflect on the tenor of politics overall and what may have led to this moment. As you say, Emily, we do not know the political motivations of the alleged assassin. Maybe he will be left-wing, maybe he'll be right-wing. I mean, who knows? What we can see is that, or what is, I think, probably beyond doubt, is that on some level he will have been radicalised. He will be a radicalised person. And the key central point is that all of American politics, and increasingly because we pick it up through osmosis, British politics, as we were discussing yesterday with the Tommy Robinson rally and Elon Musk role, is becoming increasingly radicalised. And the point is that MAGA has had, and the way it talks about politics, the tone and tenor in which it talks about politics, is part of that radicalisation. I mean, I was on that Piers Morgan show panel on Friday night, and I sort of couldn't quite believe my ears, because I was listening to a group of kind of, you know, MAGA people and influencers and so on, genuinely sitting there trying to tell me and trying to tell the audience that all political, or nearly all political invective, or nearly all the legitimisation of political violence comes from one side. And I'm sat there thinking, this is crazy. I've sort of gone on there to sort of say, well, you know, clearly political violence wherever it takes place and legitimisation is a problem wherever it happens. And the argument seems to be, and it's the argument that Vance has been making and Trump has been making, that the problem just comes from one direction or one thing, which is the left or the centre left or whoever calling them fascist or Nazis or whatever it is, and that raises the temperature. And, you know, you sat there thinking, hang on a minute. Okay, yeah, I mean, you can make an argument about whether it's appropriate to call Trump or whoever a fascist or a Nazi or far right or whatever, you could say that acting in an authoritarian way is worse than being called an authoritarian. But leaving that to one side, I mean, we've talked so many times. Look at the general tone of kind of MAGA X, MAGA social online accounts. We are constantly told by these people that the end of Western civilization is just around the corner as a result of liberalism and progressive politics. They constantly say that liberalism, progressivism, whatever, is destroying our cities, that cities are a dystopian hellhole. They say that liberals, and Charlie Kirk himself said this, again, not justifying anything, but Charlie Kirk himself said this. They constantly say that the great replacement theory is a real thing. And Vance himself comes over to the UK and says that freedom of speech is about to be destroyed at any particular moment. And so you're like, I'm sorry, who's raising the temperature here? Who's raising the temperature here? This is a phenomenon which is going on in politics generally. And if you are sat there day after day after day, week after week, basically predicting, as I say, the end of Western civilization, which is something that is constantly, that is where the politics of the right has moved to, then you really can't say that the only group in society which is perhaps letting themselves get a little bit too heated by the use of the word far right or fascism or whatever is the progressive left. That is crazy.
Yeah, it's kind of a brilliant weapon to say we are allowed to act with fascist tendencies, authoritarian tendencies, dictator tendencies.
But you can't call us.
But you can't call it out.
Yeah.
You can't call it out because then you are inciting violence.
And by the way, we can call you far left as much as we want. We can call you a communist, as they did with Kamala Harris the whole time, as much as they want.
Well, yeah, a Marxist.
Indeed.
We've now heard that Trump is thinking of designating Antifa, which stands for anti-fascist, a domestic terror organisation. I think you're also pointing to something that is genuinely confusing for us, which is, are the people in the Trump administration just not seeing the stuff that's happening on the left? Are they not seeing the violence and the murders on the left? Are they generally not aware of it? I mean, you mentioned Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's husband, last week. There was a moment in the Oval Office where Trump was trying to answer a question. He talked about lowering the flag for Charlie Kirk, and one of the reporters there said, why didn't you lower it for the Democrat Melissa Haltman, the congresswoman who was killed in Minneapolis, again, murdered in cold blood on her doorstep? And Trump doesn't know who they're talking about. Just replay that in your mind. The first thing he says is, I'm not familiar with that. Why isn't that name as familiar to him? It's a congresswoman. She was elected to Congress and she was murdered in cold blood. Why doesn't he know that name? And then he says, no one asked me to. It didn't occur to me. Why didn't it occur to him? So is there an absolute blind spot where you just think that people on the left, people, not far left, but standing for the Democratic Party, it's okay for them to disappear, it's okay for them to be murdered, but not somebody who is your close friend? It makes absolutely no sense. And the other thing that's really complicated is how they then manage to square all this with, drumroll, free speech. I mean, we've called out the hypocrisy before, but it does strike me that they're going to get in a real tangle over this because they are now, in the name of a free speech activist, trying to ban free speech.
Except they won't, will they? Because they'll just declare that this is different. I mean, that's what's extraordinary about the last 24. I mean, or the last week. I mean, to see the MAGA movement discover that actually there should be some limitations on free speech after all. Although it feeds into what we've always said, which is, so often with these so-called free speech champions, what they really mean is, I'm free to say what I like, but you're definitely not free to say what you like. Now, I would actually agree that some of the reaction and some of the, if you're employed by the federal government, whatever, if you've posted a video where you glorify or justify the murder of anybody, absolutely outrageous and disgraceful. And I can absolutely see a situation in which you would lose your job, for sure. But this cuts against exactly the intellectual thrust of everything these people have always argued. I mean, to see this weekend, for example, it's not just about hate speech and limitations on free speech. To see the MAGA right also discover their inner cancel culture, which is, some people may have seen over the weekend a very unfortunate incident, very stupid young man, the incoming president-elect of the Oxford Union, become a massive core celeb. He obviously sent some WhatsApp, which would appear to show that, he's sort of celebrating or making fun of Charlie Kirk's murder. Awful, terrible, stupid student. stupid thing to do. I'm sure he regrets it enormously. But all of the sort of online right in the UK and the US calling on the Oxford Union to dissociate themselves, make sure that he doesn't become the actual Oxford Union president, just this silly, stupid debating society at Oxford University. But not only that, but then pulling up his academic record, trying to cancel a guy suggesting that he's a DEI hire. I mean, this was online bullying and discrimination of the kind of highest order being done on a transatlantic political level.
Yeah, and close to home, we've just had Trump now calling out a lawsuit on the New York Times for $15 billion. He's such a fan of free speech in his own backyard that he now wants to sue the New York Times for an article it wrote because it endorsed Kamala Harris in the 2024 campaign, and he hopes to get $15 billion out of that. The one thing I would say, though, and I actually think in all this discussion, the thing that has possibly shocked me the most is that we have given up even mentioning guns or gun control. You know, the whole shooting incident happened on a campus with what we understand was a young man with a rifle and a very good aim. And yet nobody is even bothering to talk about guns. Nobody's even talking about the weapons. Nobody's even talking about the idea that you might cut down the actual violence, whatever the rhetoric is, whatever the language is. Because, I mean, you know, call me naive, but 10 years ago, we were covering every single kind of school shooting in America and trying to think which will be the one that brings whoever is in power to the place where something changes. You know, would it be Sandy Hook, which involved 6 and 7-year-olds? Would it be the Parkland shooting, which involved students, young university students? Would it be the one that involved people in a nightclub in Orlando? You know, we haven't even bothered to start that conversation this time round. We've completely given up on ever expecting America to do anything about its gun culture.
And I think the chilling thing about this is that this isn't just confined to what Vance is saying or even what Trump is saying or what Miller is saying. You know, the whole administration is now gearing behind, it appears, an effort in Charlie Kirk's name, in the name of his appalling assassination, his appalling murder, to weed out, to extinguish, to suppress political dissent from within the administration and without. So, you know, we even saw, you know, Pete Hegseth, Defense Secretary, going to Congress.
No, he's not the Defense Secretary.
Sorry, you're right. The War Secretary.
I mean, sorry, but
because that's not chilling at all, is it?
Because
that's
it
not
plays
worrying.
to what feels like a militarization.
Yes, completely,
right?
exactly. The War Secretary and some of his underlings saying that his agencies are closely tracking any military personnel who celebrated mock Mr. Kirk's death. Deputy Secretary of State saying the administration is going to strip visas from individuals who celebrated Mr. Kirk's death. And you might think on one level, okay, fair enough, that's awful. But who's going to decide that? Who's going to be judge, jury and executioner as to what celebrating Charlie Kirk's death is going to be? And you've got, you know, Republican representatives going to Congress saying that they're going to seek immediate bans for life. Bans from social media platforms for, again, anyone who belittled the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And again, you can have an argument about what these rules should be, but A, clearly, well, that is cancelling people,
yeah.
And B, what are the rules of that going to be? And again, the feeling that there is just this authoritarian streak in the United States right now that scares people. And again, it feeds exactly into that conversation we've just been having. Why is it that people are becoming radicalised? Why is it easier to radicalise people? Why is it easier to... Why are so many people becoming desensitised to political violence? Well, one of the reasons is because people are scared. People are scared by the sorts of things that they're hearing from the administration right now. I was thinking yesterday, imagine when Jode Cox was killed, and she was killed by a far-right thug who literally screamed as she was walking down the street, "Britain first," right? Far-right thug.
Which is the name of a far-right organisation.
Indeed so. Imagine if David Cameron, who was Prime Minister at the time, and remember, this was taking place in the midst of...
It was a week before the Brexit
the referendum. Yeah. Imagine if David Cameron had come out and weaponised that assassination in the name of Remain in the way that Trump had done. That was what the equivalent would be. It would be him saying, trying to associate this with the Leave campaign, trying to say, like, we're going to use the mechanisms of the state, the institutions of the state to go after people we think who have celebrated her death or are connected with the Leave campaign. That would be the equivalent. That would be the equivalent. And that would have been abhorrent. It would have been wrong. It would have been disgusting. And that is basically the equivalent of what we're seeing today from the Trump administration.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the kind of actions that Vance is talking about taking now, and as I say, at the very beginning, I would have allowed for a certain amount of anger and that sense of reprisal and that sense of grief that comes from losing a friend. But he's now talking about rethinking, for example, the tax treatment of foundations on the left. In other words, he doesn't like George Soros's Open Society. He doesn't like the Ford Foundation. He thinks that if they've written articles he disagrees with, then that has to, go into their pockets. And you get to a point where you're sort of looking at the spread, and you're starting to add up a few of the pieces, and you've got Trump saying, well, I'm going to bring the military, I'm going to bring, the National Guard onto the streets of the cities that I think are dangerous. Not the dangerous ones statistically, but the ones that he thinks are dangerous, which tends to be the blue states. Then you've got Vance saying, I'm going to take away money from the organisations that I think are behind whatever he called a domestic terror network. Then you've got the attempt to shut down the press. You're trying to gag places like the New York Times for writing articles and for what it puts on its front page. And it does seem that if you add all these together, what you get are the tentacles of a state that no longer trusts its citizens. It's basically deciding that autocracy and authoritarianism is the only way that America can survive. And then you're being asked to say, oh, well, that's all being done in the name of, sorry, free speech, sorry, an attempt to kind of let America flourish. And Trump's about to come over here. We're going to talk about that later, perhaps. But Trump's coming over here, and our Prime Minister is terrified that he's going to talk about Britain's free speech problem. I mean, in what world does he not just tell Trump to look at his own backyard?
And look, I think there is often hypocrisy on every side when it comes to political violence, when it's done against your own side versus the other. I mean, I think, do the right have a point when they say, well, the left didn't seem to have a problem with political violence. Okay, not murdering people, but disorder when George Floyd was killed. I think that's a fair enough point. And was it the case that journalists on the left or liberal left or whatever was looking at that at the time and going, well, that's terrible disorder, or because of the way the kind of left looks at those things, do they say, well, that's a sort of legitimate response to all these structural problems? I think that's fair enough, and I can see that hypocrisy. But then, if we're actually going to move on from this, it is necessary for every side to reflect, and that is not happening at all. And what's really tragic about it as well is that actually these ideas around political violence are actually at quite an elite level. I mean, there's been so much academic research and polling done in the United States which shows that actually the tolerance for political violence for both Democrats and Republicans is very low. But the really interesting thing is that both Democrats and Republicans believe that the other side does tolerate political violence. Indeed, even though that 2 to 3% of Americans think that political violence is okay, Democrats and Republicans both estimate that between 20 and 30% of Democrats and Republicans think that it's okay, that the other side think that it's okay. So that shows the polarization which is taking place in American society, right? And the fact that elites like Vance and Trump are feeding this propaganda that the other side thinks that political violence is okay, when the truth is in America, neither side, actually, the vast majority of people don't think it's okay.
Yeah, completely right. I mean, all I'd say is that I don't think the polarisation of political thought is what was at play with the murder of Charlie Kirk.
No.
I mean, we do not understand the motives, and that is part of the problem, that some young man who had access to a gun seems to have felt so kind of nihilistic about his life or the world or the state of things that he didn't really know what his political ideology was. He didn't know, there is nothing that says he was left or right. There's a complete mishmash of everything that went into what he seems to indicate he thought. And that's the problem. And whilst politicians are talking about the left and right, they're missing all of that.
Well, that's the hypocrisy. Because I remember, again, going back to Joe Cox example, I remember, what did Nigel Farage say after that? He just said, he's just a nutter. He's just a nutter. And that's fine, but if that's your explanation, then it has to be your explanation
for everything.
Full stop.
Yeah.
For everything, for everyone. Either the political environment and framework does make a difference to people, or it doesn't. And really, the only coherent position is to decide that it's one or the other.
Well, as we record, there is an emergency debate going on in the House of Commons over questions that still surround what Keir Starmer did or didn't know about Peter Mandelson's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein before he was appointed to that role of US ambassador. It was called by the Tory grandee David Davis, and he has picked out a lot of incidents in Peter Mandelson's past which he says should have basically been flags to the Prime Minister. But one of the most interesting exchanges has come from a Labour grandee, Dame Emily Thornberry, the chairwoman of the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, who has asked, I think, what will turn out to be a pretty pertinent question in this whole thing. Was the Foreign Office told to overlook Mandelson's history with Jeffrey Epstein during his vetting? Here's what she said.
So the question is this. Did the Cabinet Office miss the glaring red flag of Lord Mandelson's relationship with Epstein? Or did it fail to pass those concerns on? And if so, why? The Foreign Secretary's letter states that Cabinet Office due diligence was followed by the usual developed vetting, or DV process, carried out by National Security Vetting on behalf of the FCDO after the announcement of Lord Mandelson's appointment. This was, the Foreign Secretary says, conducted to the usual standard set of developed vetting. Now, career civil servants are regularly subject to such tests, and many have stories of their appointments being delayed or even prohibited because they've studied abroad, because they've married an Iranian, or because they were simply born in Belfast. So the question is this: does having significant information in the public domain about your relationship with an internationally prolific child sex offender not raise more red flags than simply being born in Belfast?
Yeah, my understanding is that this has been a point of some contention within Whitehall about the Foreign Office trying to distance itself from all of this and sort of making it clear from within Whitehall that this was very much a number 10 centrally directed operation, which would confirm what we sort of know, right, which is that Morgan McSweeney, the Prime Minister's chief advisor, was very keen on the Peter Mandelson appointment. They're very, very close allies. Indeed, that Morgan McSweeney himself was arguing for Mandelson to stay in the job to the bitter end, which has renewed a focus on him from Labour MPs, because pretty much, I mean, there's not much that unites the Parliamentary Labour Party. But one of the things that certainly has over the last couple of the weeks is the blind fury that they feel that they are being compelled to expend political capital over Mandelson, a figure who has got a checkered history himself, certainly with the Labour Party, but particularly in this situation where they feel that, you know, having gone so hard really recently on this question of child protection, online child protection, this sort of stuff, that now they're being associated with, in their view, and the Prime Minister associated with them for too long, basically in association with, vicariously, Mandelson to Epstein, the most prolific child sex trafficker of our age.
I mean, it's difficult to spend 1 week calling Nigel Farage sort of paedophile adjacent because he doesn't like the online harms bill, and the next sort of saying, oh, well, you know, we can overlook this man who
was worth the risk.
Very much, paedophile adjacent because he was worth the risk. I mean, my understanding was that things happened very, very quickly on Thursday morning. The interview that Peter Mandelson had given was actually given on Tuesday night to Harry Cole at The Sun. That was Washington time. And the whole question remained as to what had happened to that tranche of Bloomberg emails, which Peter Mandelson had definitely seen and had sent on to the Foreign Office, and the question of whether Keir Starmer had seen them or said, I don't want to see them. But I think it came to a head when Yvette Cooper, who would have had to answer the urgent question at 10:30 on Thursday morning, from what I understand, refused to stand up until she knew there had been a resolution. In other words, it had to come to a head pretty quickly that morning, which is why we now read Peter Mandelson was woken in his residence, the embassy, at about 5:30 on Thursday morning and told that that was it. I mean, that was it.
And now there is a lot of speculation doing the rounds in Westminster as to whether Mandelson himself is so aggrieved by what happened and the manner of his departure that he may himself be trying to drive some of the negative briefing which is going on towards number 10. And speculation again. I don't know, A, whether it's true, and B, whether
because
in his...
he refused to resign.
Because,
I think he was asked to resign. He refused to resign and waited for that sacking to come on Thursday morning.
And whether, Mandelson, for all of his obviously many faults and his checkered past, is someone who knows the Labour Party inside out and is a political operator. And there is speculation that maybe this is a kind of Dominic Cummings-esque, Boris Johnson-esque situation where Mandelson will be so aggrieved that he will try and damage Keir Starmer. I'm not completely convinced about that, A, because I think Mandelson is sort of Labour Party to his bones, and I wonder whether he'd want to do that, and B, whether he is actually such a diminished figure now as to what he would be able to do. But nonetheless, it represents yet more instability in a week which is proving, really, really difficult for Starmer. He also lost one of his top political advisors, a guy that most people wouldn't have heard of, a guy called Paul Ovenden. Some emails have emerged which show that he was, about 10 years ago, sent some pretty derogatory texts about Diane Abbott. He's had to go, gives a sense of kind of just a spiralling operation. And overnight as well, more substantial perhaps than anything else, this heralded deal between the UK and France that was a sort of one in, one out policy on asylum boats. Well, it turns out the first plane was supposed to take off in the last 24 hours. And once again, familiar story, not a single asylum seeker was on board due to last minute legal challenges, which is obviously very, very embarrassing. And you've got Trump coming into town as well, who obviously represents a deeply, well, who knows what's going to happen when Trump comes into town, particularly with all these questions about free speech, Tommy Robinson, Musk circulating in the air.
I mean, technically, Trump is not coming into town.
No, he's coming in, he's going to Stansted.
Stansted. I mean, God bless him, You wouldn't really...
You wouldn't wish that on your worst enemy, would you?
Exactly. And he is avoiding most of the British public as he conducts his tour. We understand that the first meetings, the royal meetings, are obviously going to be within the grounds of Windsor Castle, and the second day is going to be within the grounds of Chequers and the House at Chequers. So the idea, I mean, I don't know whether Trump's loathing of London Mayor Sadiq Khan comes primarily from the fact that last time he was here, Khan signed off on a demonstration that saw a big blow-up, nappied balloon of Trump floating around the London skyline, and thousands took to the streets to march. I don't know whether that was just too much for Trump to bear, to sort of see how the British public felt about him. And so there is going to be, from what I know, I think there is a demonstration, but there isn't.
Won't see it.
He won't see it, and he won't be anywhere near what we like to call real people this time around.
Number 10 will just be hoping once again they can get to the end of the week without too much incident, which is probably part of their problem. We'll be covering the Trump visit, of course.
We will.
I'll see you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.